So the third part of this topic then is immune responses and vaccinations. Now this links together with what we talked about in the last video, antigens and antibodies. So remember, antibodies were produced by the lymphocytes. They have a shape which matches the antigens. The antibodies and antigens clump together, which immobilizes the microbe, making it easier to destroy them. So it's important to remember those facts before we go on. Now, our immune responses can generally be split up into a primary and secondary response. The primary response takes place after the first infection with a pathogen, and it generally involves antibodies being produced slowly and their numbers are low. The secondary response then occurs after you get reinfected with the same pathogen, and it causes antibodies to be produced very rapidly and reach a much higher level. And that's because at the end of the primary response, you get memory lymphocytes produced. So at the end, memory lymphocytes are produced. Now, these have the job of recognizing the pathogen once it enters your body for the second time. They can divide and start to produce lots and lots of antibodies very, very rapidly. Now, the secondary response is also so fast that we're often unaware as we show no symptoms of the disease. So, in the primary response, it's slow because antibodies are produced at pretty low numbers. So, in the primary response, you probably will get sick. The secondary response is much faster, where antibodies are produced much more rapidly and reach a higher level due to the memory lymphocytes were produced. And in this one, you don't get sick. Now, this little graph just shows the differences between the primary and secondary response. So this is the primary response, where you get your first infection. Now, your level of antibodies will rise slowly to this level, and then you'll fight off the infection and you'll start to get better. Now, antibodies only stay in your body for a couple of months. If you don't need them, they just get broken down until basically you get reinfected again. So your antibody levels drop. Then there's a big time lag in here. Now, this can be months or years. So it can be a very long time between the first and second infection. Then, when you get infected for the second time, the secondary response takes place. Now, you'll notice here that if we compare this part with this part is much steeper, so you produce much more antibodies much more quickly. And as well as that, the level of that primary response is there, secondary is there. So you produce far more antibodies. So, two differences between the primary and secondary response. In the secondary, you get faster production of antibodies and you get many more antibodies produced. And as I say, you're often unaware of the second infection because we show no symptoms due to the fast response. The fast response was due to the memory lymphocytes. So, that's the primary and secondary response. The next little section is all about immunity. So immunity is when you're protected against getting a certain disease. And this is because your antibody levels are high enough to destroy the microbe if it enters your body again. Now, there's two types of immunity, active and passive immunity. Now, this part here at the very bottom just shows you what active immunity is. This is where the body produces its own antibodies in response to the infection. Whereas passive immunity is where antibodies are injected into the body or from the mother to baby in the placenta or breast milk. Now, it's passive because your body doesn't produce its own antibodies and you will only have immunity for a short period of time. Now, this is the difference between active and passive immunity. So active immunity is generally quite slow and antibody levels will remain high for a long period of time due to your memory lymphocytes. Whereas passive immunity, because it's when you get an injection of antibodies really quickly, you get a rapid increase in antibodies, but their levels will fall quickly because no memory lymphocytes have been produced. So let's look at each one in a bit more detail. So active immunity then is when your body produces your own antibodies. And this happens when you're infected with a pathogen or after you receive a vaccination. And this type of immunity is slow acting but long lasting. So the first thing that happens here is you get infected with the microbe. Now, the next thing that happens is your antibody levels will rise slowly in response to the microbe infection. And that's just because it takes time for the microbe to come into contact with the correct lymphocyte and for that lymphocyte to produce the antibodies. So your antibody levels rise quite slowly. Now, during this stage, you probably will end up getting sick if it's an infection. And you'll probably remain sick until you produce enough antibodies to reach this level. Once you get past this level, you will have enough antibodies to fight off the infection and start to get better. Now, in active immunity, the antibody levels will remain high for a very long time, and that's because you've produced memory lymphocytes, so the next time the microbe gets into your body, you will be able to fight off the infection really, really quickly. So 2 features of active immunity then. Your body produces its own antibodies, but unfortunately it's slow, but that's okay because it's going to protect you for a long time. So your body makes its own antibodies, it's slow but long lasting. Now this gives you a little flowchart showing what's happening. So after the first infection, the microbe enters the body. Your lymphocytes get activated, they produce antibodies which have a complementary shape to the antigen. They clump and the antigen is destroyed and memory cells are produced. And you'll get better from the infection. But the next thing that happens is the microbe re-enters the body. Now, this can take place after months or years. So the microbe re-enters the body. The memory cells are activated and produce the antibodies, and they clump and the antibodies are destroyed. Now, this part here is slow because it takes time to produce enough antibodies to fight the infection. But it's long lasting. The body produces the memory cells which fight the microbe when it re-enters. So the second time, it's much faster because of the memory lymphocytes. Now, that's an example of active immunity because your lymphocytes produce antibodies here and your lymphocytes produce antibodies here. It's long lasting because you can be immune months or years after the first infection. Passive immunity, on the other hand, is a little bit different. This is where your body does not make its own antibodies. As I said, you can get an injection of antibodies from a lab, antibodies in breast milk, or antibodies crossing the placenta during pregnancy. Now, we still have the level of antibody required to produce immunity, but this time we see that there's a really sharp rise in the levels of antibodies, and that's because they're usually given as an injection. So, passive immunity, the body doesn't make its own antibodies. The levels of antibodies will rise rapidly because they're just injected straight into you, but then they'll also fall again, so it's short lasting. Now, here's the reasons why. It's short lived because the antibodies don't last long and there are no memory cells produced. It's very fast because the antibodies are ready made. So you don't have to wait for your lymphocytes to find the antigen and then start producing the correct antibodies. You just get an injection of the correct antibodies. So again, we'll compare active and passive immunity. Active is where there's a slow increase in antibodies during the primary response, but your antibody levels remain high for a long time due to the memory lymphocytes. And active immunity is where your body produces its own antibodies in response to infection. In passive immunity, there's a rapid increase of antibodies in the blood. The antibody levels fall quickly because there's no memory lymphocytes present. And it's passive. In passive immunity, the antibodies are injected into the body from the mother to the baby in the placenta or in breast milk. Now, this brings us on to vaccinations. So a vaccination is basically creating a form of active immunity, but in this, you don't get sick. So it's active immunity, but you don't get sick. Now, because it's active immunity, you produce your own antibodies. Don't know what's going on here. And you produce your own memory lymphocytes. Now, here's how it works. The vaccination contains dead or weakened microbes. Now, because these microbes will still have their antigen on their surface, it causes the body to produce the antibodies in the same way as having the disease. But because they're dead or weakened microbes, it doesn't make you sick. Now, what will happen is, after the initial vaccination, your body will start to produce its own lymphocytes. But sometimes they don't reach a high enough level to make you immune. So sometimes what you'll get is a second vaccination, or what it's sometimes called is a booster. The booster will be given to you, and that will cause a much greater increase in the levels of antibodies. And this means that you can produce a level of antibodies which makes you immune. But as with active immunity, it was slow to act, but long lasting. So for example, most people nowadays are given vaccinations for tuberculosis and things like that whenever they're born, and they might not ever need a booster. So therefore, it's quite long lasting. So a vaccination then, as I said, was a type of active immunity. This is exactly the same process as active immunity. The only difference is that the first infection is caused by an injection of dead or weakened pathogens, or even just the antigens, which still stimulates your lymphocytes to produce antibodies, which then destroy the antigens, and you produce your memory cells. So that means that when the second infection occurs, which can take place naturally, your memory cells will be able to produce the antibodies and destroy the infection much quicker the second time. Now, it's known as artificial active immunity. They also produce immune response. So your body produces the memory cells and you become immune, but this time you will not get sick at all. And a booster then, remember, is just a second vaccination, which is only really given if you are not immune after the first vaccination. And just to finish this section off, plants also have defense mechanisms, but because they don't have a blood system, they don't have things like lymphocytes and phagocytes. Instead, each cell has to be able to fight infections. So here's two ways in which they can fight infections or diseases. They have got different structures, such as the waxy cuticle helps prevent microbes entering the leaf. But in each of their cells, they can have certain chemicals. For example, they can have antimicrobial chemicals, which fight bacteria, viruses, and fungi. Some examples of plants which have antibacterial properties are mint, garlic, and digitalis. In the next video, we're going to look at some little experiments where you can actually see which plants are the best at killing bacteria using petri dishes and little spots and little bacterial colonies. Thank you, goodbye.